Hi. I first want to thank my collaborators, Joey Curdy and Brad Schaefer from UCLA. Without their work, this project wouldn't have been possible, as well as my thesis advisor, Casey Terhorst from Cal State Northridge. Do you need airlifted out? That was what my boss at the time asked me over the phone. Earlier that day, I had left work early. There was there's a shooting at a bar called Borderline in Thousand Oaks, and it really devastated our community, and I just couldn't focus on work. And I just needed to get out of there. So I went into the hills and looked for one of my favorite plants, Coryzanthe periephernanina. It's only found on two hills on Earth, and it was very dry and windy. A lot of the grasses, Bromus rubens, had senesced, and I knew this plant would have senesced already too, but I wanted to see it in its habitat. And that's when the smoke started, and that's when my boss asked me that question. This was a part of the Woolsey Fire in the Santa Monica Mountains in November 2018. It's one of the largest wildfires in Los Angeles history. A lot of devastation. When the fire started, I walked back to my car. I went back to my apartment and I lost it. I cried and cried. Um, the hills that I loved is just now up in flames. It really It was really hard for our community. But out of this, a lot of really fascinating science came out of it. We found large populations of an endangered plant, Astragalus browntonii. And because of this and other factors, a lot of ecologists got together at the national park and we asked ourselves, how can we study and grow from this? How can we get undergraduates more involved in fire ecology? And this is the project that came out of it. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that given climate change, invasive plants are spreading in range and becoming more of an issue. Especially given anthropogenic disturbance, such as development and dispersal, where people are bringing plants on their shoes, on their construction equipment, and especially in an area like Los Angeles, where we have such a huge population, invasives are really taking charge. Such as the Siffard paper from 2018 shows the just massive expansion of invasive annual grasses. Given climate change as well, we have dramatic shifts in precipitation, and with some years being too much precipitation and most other years being drought, it's favoring these invasive annual grasses and leading to their range expansion as well. And there's possible negative effects on herbaceous fire followers, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as shrubling survival, young shrubs, and how they manage on the landscape. Now, given this range expansion of invasive annual plants, there's also an interaction with burn severity and burn frequency, but also the change of landscape and what that looks like, right? So if you have too many fires in an area, such as the part on the right, too frequent of fires, you can have type conversion of the community from something that's kind of dominated by California native plants that's more invasive annuals, and this area will then burn more frequently as well. And this middle in the region in the middle has a lot of native plants. There's some invasives in there, but it's mostly things that respond pretty positively to wildfire. And that area is a little more resilient to invasion. And then the region towards the back burns kind of infrequently at a more typical fire return interval and has thick shrub canopy. Now, fire followers, where I talked about before, are these native plants that respond well to fire and are adapted to fire. Now, this drawing was done by Leslie Gorin. Please take a picture of this and support her. That takes you to her page where you can buy art and clothing that she's made. And Leslie and I collaborated to do this drawing, and she's done a lot of other draw scientific illustrations for scientists. And this just demonstrates what that change in fire followers looks like after a wildfire week after week. And we described it as like waves of colors that change, that you go from the whites to the pinks to the purples to the yellows to the oranges and deep reds. And it's just spectacular. But what about invasives when they're in the mix of this rainbow change of color after a wildfire? So let's look at burn severity and how that's going to interact with composition of species. So in an intact shrubland, you have these large shrubs, very woody, a lot of biomass, and they're dumping seeds into the seed bank. And you also will have like fire followers and other natives. There's just been waiting years and years for open canopy space in the seed bank as well. A large fire happens, very high intensity, and a lot of that biomass burns off. And then what comes up after it? Well, it's probably some fire followers, maybe it's some shrublings as well. But I wonder, is this higher burn severity going to be associated with higher species richness? And we'd like to look at that. Another thing that's really interesting is, so let's say you have an area that's mostly invasive species, right? And the fire that happens as a result of it is going to be a very low intensity fire compared to shrubs, right? And what comes up after is much of the same. Like a lot of those same invasive annual grasses are going to come up, but you'll also get some forbs as well. But how are those invasives competing with the native plants, right? So if any forbs do come up, then how are they going to do given the phenology after a fire? So let's look at this. What did we do? So we had about 40 undergrads from local universities, community college, with no botany experience whatsoever, just except for like a few of us. And we trained them how to be fire ecologists. We also compensated them with gas cards and Target gift cards. And they had 10 1 by 1 meter quadrats along a 100-meter transect that they monitored. They took pictures out and they collected data, species present, percent cover, and species count data. So individual like abundances, which is really cool. And they also did burn severity from the burnt shrub limb thickness. And now I'm going to talk about this right now. So what we did was give them calipers, and they did 3 measurements and averaged them. They'd find the in the general area the smallest twig they could find next to each quadrat. And so let's say they found the Salvia apiana in a heavily mustard and grass area. This is actually a few days after the fire too. You can still see the smoke. Yeah. And if you measure one of those really small twigs, um, that area just the fire moved through it very quickly. That has a low burn severity. Now, if you look at the picture at the bottom with that shrub, so a lot of biomass got burned. What's left are these really big trunks, and that indicates a high severity fire. So if your large measurement's larger, it was a high severity fire. So for data collection, like I said, the students had no botany backgrounds. So they would make these little herbarium cards, and they'd tape the specimens to cards and call them these cute little names. And I would then have to go through thousands of photos, verify their data, and identify the plants that they put onto these herbarium cards. I used the Judson Manual eFlora as well as the Santa Monica Mountains Wildflower app. And the analysis I did was we had 27 sites of good data that we could examine burn severity by comparing USGS data from the monitoring trends in burn severity to the twig thickness that we collected at each quadrat. And then for 16 sites, we could examine what happened the first month after a wildfire for natives and non-natives. So that's just like right after the fire in the growing season. And then for 10 sites, we could examine what happened from February to May to observe phenological shifts in time. So the location is the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. It's one of the largest national park regions that's urban in the United States. It's as well as the Simi Hills, and it's a massive area. And it's a mix of national park, federal land, state park, nonprofit, regional parks, and they all kind of work together in the goal of conservation. Well, this fire just burned about 50% of the entire mountain range. It's a super biodiverse, rich area. Um, and so what I'm showing here is the where our plots are in the blue dots, and the brighter pink or purple is like higher severity using the NMDS, which was from the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity data set. In the south is Malibu, and up north is where the national park headquarters is in Thousand Oaks. So at each one of the transects, I'm going to show you what it's like to go from like February to May. And so this is right in February after the fire. You see there's some fire followers that are coming up. Some are bigger than others. Super cool. And then March comes around. Those fire followers are getting bigger. You might have some baby shrubs start to appear in places. Now in April, you're getting a lot of those lepidopterans coming in and eating a lot of the flower material. And so some seeds are fruits are starting to senesce. Really cool stuff. And the shrubs are kind of growing up into their own. And then by May, things are drying out. A lot of the forbs are dead. And you're getting a lot of these shrubs that are coming in, which is just super cool to witness through time. So let's talk about like what we found. So we found that a lower burn severity was associated with a higher invasive species abundance, which that tracks. Like I said, these are invasive species are mostly fine fuels, so they have lower biomass. So when they burn, it's going to be at a lower intensity than if it was a lot of native plants, a lot of which are shrubs, not the majority of them, but a lot of them are, and they have more woody material and thicker biomass. But there's a lot of like native forbs and stuff like that as well, but they weren't native plants. We did not find this sort of statistically significant relationship, but definitely with invasive species. And invasive, by the way, is categorized by the California Native Plant I'm sorry, the California Invasive Plant Council, which determines their negative cultural, economic, or ecological harm. We also found there was an increased species richness at frequently burned sites. And this is kind of counterintuitive to what we would have assumed, because we did find higher invasive species abundance at frequently burned sites. But we also found increased species richness. So, and this didn't fall along lines of like, oh, it was mostly invasive species, or oh, it was mostly native species or fire followers. It was kind of a grab bag of kind of a lot of communities. I think this is particularly in coastal communities by Malibu that have been inhabited for thousands of years by the Chumash and the Tataviam. And so these are systems that were used for people by food, and fire was a part of that. And so they're highly disturbance adapted areas. So you might have some invasives in there. There's also been some cattle grazing history that stopped around the 70s. So it's a complicated region that has a lot of has had a lot of disturbance in it. So it's hard to say like whether or not it's invasives or whatever. So I think this should be investigated further. I think it's super fascinating. Another thing we found was that invasives are quick to set seed post-wildfire. So this was from that February to May data set, that when invasives hit about April, May, they drop seed, and versus a lot of the natives and the fire followers, they were still around by May, maybe like June, July is when they started to die off. So the grass seeds would be able to fill the seed bank faster, and perhaps take optimal space over a lot of the native plants. So I think this, again, needs to be investigated further, as potentially they could have a competitive advantage in the seed bank over native plants. So some conclusions and suggestions. Invasives were associated with a lower burn severity, more frequent fires, but also higher diversity in those transects, which is kind of counterintuitive to what we would have think, because the system is more adapted for a fire every 30 to perhaps 150 years. We had sites that we didn't have a record of a fire, and they were some very intact ecosystems. Fine-scale monitoring can reveal burn severity information that remote sensing can miss. A lot of burn monitoring trends in burn severity can be very coarse data. So actually going into the chaparral and the shrublands and seeing burn severity by boulders, by man-made structures, by these plants can be really important for getting a more nuanced perspective on how what the fire is doing in the region versus just satellite imagery. And we need to treat for grasses in disturbed post-wildfire areas in the first few months of the growing season. And this could be, grazing or herbicide, but it needs to be in already heavily disturbed areas, perhaps areas that have been type converted from, shrubland to predominantly invasive annuals, because if in some of these species-rich, frequently burned areas, there is a mix of like natives and non-natives. So we want to make sure if we are treating that it's an area that's basically just all non-natives. And we suggest this in the first few months of the wildfire, given how readily grass sets seed and can be outcompeting any of the natives that are trying to eke out in this invaded ecosystem. A lot of people I'd like to thank. The California Native Plant Society funded a lot of my work at the national park for all their service, but especially the Chumash and the Tatambian people, who I did my research and analysis on their land, um, and the UCLA Lacrette Center with Brad Schaefer, and of course my thesis advisor again. If you have questions, I'd love to hear them. Please follow me on Instagram as well as Twitter, which is X and dying. But my current lab is the Trevor Coughlin at Boise State University. We're studying goathead. It's super cool. So please check out our map at goatheadmap.com. Yeah, thank you so much.